All right, let's get started. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Will Penfield on behalf of Everbridge. I'm excited to present this webinar, Active Shooter Preparedness, Maturing Your Organization's Plans and Procedures. In this webinar, our presenters will discuss common assumptions about active shooter events, past examples of active shooter events, the evolving threat, and best practices for preparation and response. After the presentation, we will have a question and answer session with our speakers. As a reminder, you can submit your questions at any time during the webinar. You may send your questions by typing in the open text field in the questions panel and sending your question to all panelists. If time runs out before your question is asked, we will try to follow up with you after the event. Links to the recording of the webinar and slides from today's presentation will be available on our blog within a few days of today's session. You can also look for a link to recordings for all of our webinars on everbridge.com under our resources section. If you're on Twitter, we encourage you to take a moment to follow us at Everbridge and use the webinar hashtag ActiveShooterPrep to share snippets of insight throughout our program with your followers. We'll even retweet some of your comments. And now I'd like to introduce you to our speakers. Stephen M. Crimando is the Principal of Behavioral Science Applications, a consulting and training firm dedicated to human factors and crisis response. Steve is a nationally recognized expert in prevention, response, and recovery of workplace and campus violence and active shooter incidents. He has developed violence prevention and active shooter response plans, programs, and exercises for government agencies, hospital and healthcare systems, and multinational corporations. He has published many professional articles on this topic and serves as an expert to the media and the courts in the area of active shooter intervention, and served as a consultant on the New York City Police Department Counterterrorism Division Active Shooter Recommendations and Analysis for Risk Mitigation Project, and the National Criminal Justice Training Center's Comprehensive Active Shooter Incident Management distance learning curriculum funded by the U.S. Department of Justice. From Everbridge, we have Michael Zhang, who is a Senior Product Manager here. He'll be providing a brief overview of the company and detailing how we can help your organization during an active shooter event with critical communication. We are excited and honored to have our speakers here with us today. And now I'd like to turn it over to our first presenter. Steve, you may begin.
Thanks, Will. I'm waiting for you to hand me over the controls, and we'll be ready to go in just a second. I'll ask if you can see my cover slide, and if we are, we're good to go.
Should be all set.
Okay, let me know when you can see my slide.
I don't see your slide. I see your screen, though.
See my screen.
There we go. All set.
Got my slide? Very good. So once again, thank you everybody for joining us today. I want to get going pretty quickly because we have an awful lot of content to cover. Really four major sections of our program today, and roughly about 10 minutes each for those sections. A few things as we get started. We'll give you a little bit about my background. I am a behavioral scientist by training, so I'm coming at this issue from really the study of the behavior of victims and witnesses in an active shooter situation, of first responders of different types coming into the event, and really about the shooters themselves. And what we learn about the shooters is very helpful in us understanding their behavior and how to develop effective countermeasures. We're approaching the topic today through the lens of what we refer to as operational psychology. Now, operational psychology is the use of clinical, cognitive, and social psychological ideas for their tactical or their operational value. So we're really not speaking about it from a mental health standpoint today. We're talking very concretely about what people do and what they don't do in different sort of crisis situations, and of course today very specifically in active shooter situations. And we'll be going through the program through four different evolutions. We're going to start quickly, and I say quickly because we could actually do a whole semester just on this topic in studying shooters and shooting events, and what is some of the critical milestones we should be aware of influence our planning and our response. We'll also talk about the evolution of police response and EMS response. We'll talk about the evolution of threat assessment and violence prevention approaches. And lastly, I think the most important part of the program, we'll speak about the evolution in bystander intervention. And what that evolution involves now is moving beyond run, hide, fight to a different paradigm. And that paradigm is moving to three major stages: stop the killing, stop the dying, and stop the crying. And by the end of the program, certainly you'll be able to understand where I'm coming from with those different ideas. and how maybe you can put them into use in your plans as well. Now, I want to make a little bit of a disclaimer. I work very often with a number of federal agencies who have a policy which is to never use the name of the shooters. The logic behind this is to deny them the notoriety that they seek in many of those instances, and therefore to simply avoid that. In fact, you may be aware that back in April, Google, using their Chrome browser, introduced a plugin that you can use in Chrome that will block the name of any shooters and block any images or photographs of them as well. And this is called the 0 Minutes of Fame campaign. Now, I get that. I understand that fully. I'm coming at this from a slightly different angle. And as I said, as a behavioral scientist, it helps me, and I think it helps you, to understand these individuals as people, thinking about the larger context, their psychology, their behavior. So I will be using the names of shooters in the program. And I know that does rub a few people the wrong way, but please at least understand in these circles kind of where we're coming from. Now, I'm making a few assumptions, which is always a little tricky. I'm making a few assumptions in the design of this program, and very quickly those assumptions are that this is about maturing your plan. So that suggests you have a plan, or at least you have the elements of a plan and process, and this will not be an active shooter 101 level class. So we expect that people are pretty good with the basic Department of Homeland Security approach of run, hide, fight. Perhaps you've seen or you're using the run, hide, fight video, that you are in the process or, the full swing of having or developing a plan. Now, having said that, active shooter plans have to vary across industries and settings. Certainly we spoke last week about healthcare and hospitals, a very different sort of setting, and plans do have to be tailored very specifically to your organization and perhaps to different units or programs within your organization. So you do have to think about what we're sharing here, and really any active shooter advice you would get as never being a one-size-fits-all approach. You really need to think about how do you personalize this, how do you customize it. Now, the other assumptions we're making are that you're good with these ideas. And the first of these ideas is that active shooter events at this point in the U.S. are not if questions. They're when and where is the next one. We know there's no geography that's particularly immune. There's no sort of industry that's particularly immune. And while we're not suggesting there's an epidemic of shootings, we know that when these happen, they happen in such a diversity of locations and different sorts of settings that none of us can feel that this is something that wouldn't affect us. So we're approaching this with a standpoint of kind of universal vulnerability. Now, I'm also assuming that you're familiar with the basic literature in this area, and if you're not, the two bedrock documents I want to recommend for your bookshelf are the most recent FBI study published in 2014. It covers a study period of 2000 to 2013. It looks at 160 different cases, but also the NYPD active shooter study. And both of these you can pull down offline at no cost as PDFs. These are very thorough and very informative and useful for us. The NYPD study, when it was repeated the second time for 2012, now incorporates 324 cases, starting with the Texas Bell Tower shooter in 1966 and going up through the end of 2012, which the last larger event of that time frame would have been Newtown, Connecticut. So just very quickly, and I don't want to belabor these statistics, we know roughly over the last decade, active shooter events around the U.S. have tripled in their frequency, from 5 to about 15 plus now each year. We're averaging an active shooter event somewhere on the order of every 64 days in the U.S. It depends a little bit on your statistics and your sources. Some sources claiming a little bit more frequently than that. And you get a kind of grim look at the casualty count associated with at least those 160 in the FBI study group. Interesting to us, and I'm going to expand on this just for a moment, you see that primarily businesses are represented as the most frequent target of these kind of events. And this includes places like retail establishments and shopping malls and things of that nature as well. And you see another big piece of the pie goes to academic settings. But I did want to mention that we're going to take an interesting twist here just in a little while when we talk about the evolution of shooting events, which is the concept of type 5 violence. And that is ideologically driven workplace violence, and it's kind of the intersection of terrorism and workplace violence. Our National Counterterrorism Center, part of the State Department, tells us that over the last 30 years, 80% of terrorism that's occurred in the U.S., it's been directed at corporations. So I'll explain the logic behind this as we move sorry about that, as we move through the program. But having said that, the idea in Type 5 violence is that as we train people to recognize the other types of warning signs associated with workplace violence, that we also have an opportunity to train them in the warning signs of terrorism. Just one or two points from the statistics that jump out for me is that every time we have an active shooter case, the national discourse, at least in the media, seems to turn to problems with the mental health system and with assault rifles. Please note that in all the major studies that suggest to us that pistols, rather than rifles of any type, are actually the most common used weapon, and predominantly semi-automatic pistols, the vast majority of these cases. And yes, long guns of different types, shotguns, rifles, and such, are in the mix, but handguns tend to be the overwhelming favorite, unfortunately, of shooters. Also interesting to us that should be informative as we move through the curriculum today is the nature of the relationship of the shooter to the victim. Now, this changes by industry. As I said when we spoke in our last webinar about healthcare and hospital settings, we mentioned that in hospital and healthcare, there tends to be much more of a relationship between the shooter and the victim. They know them in a different capacity. There's very few kind of or less random victims, let me say. In most active shooting incidents in public domains, there's no relationship. And here you see this big piece of the pie, 26% of just random victim selection, no prior relationship. But then you see the workplace and you see the campus come into this as very high representations as well. So this does change a little bit across industries. So let's start with that first evolution. And as I mentioned, we will be moving through this pretty quickly. I did have a role to play with the NYPD study, at least presenting that as it was rolled out. And that study, as I said, was 324 cases from 1966 to 2012. The first case of record that seems to be represented in the history of active shooters tends to be the Texas Bell Tower shooter. Now, let's just clarify for a moment what we mean by active shooter. So if we look at a recent event, we take something like the UCLA shooting several days ago. The shooter comes in, he assassinates, he kills a professor, he turns the gun on himself. It seems this individual, at least through the media reports, had some kind of kill list at home and maybe has killed another person before coming to the campus, is not a classic active shooter case. By definition, an active shooter case, regardless of how it's announced by the media, an active shooter case by definition tends to be the individual who's looking for a high body count. I know that's a pretty crude way to put it, but the individual is selecting a target-rich location because he or she is really looking for numbers. And in most instances, has no relationship with the victims. They're just looking for that place that's defined here as a confined space and populated place because it gives them access to big numbers. A few things to notice. We're going to talk about this idea of cold-blooded killing or predatory killing a little later as well. That the vast majority of these are about 8 to 12 minutes long with a significant portion, and by the FBI's report of those they could get a good timeline on, 69% in the study were over in 5 minutes or less. Key point, these happen very quickly, and the critical aspect for us today, one of them is the response gap. The response gap is the time between the first shot fired and the first incoming police. And what we do, and what I mean by we is bystanders, right? We're all potentially first responders in the situation. It makes an absolutely critical difference in survivability. So you as leaders in your organization, how you think about preparing the organization and your people really hinges on this idea of the response gap. Now, this is different than a shooting incident. This is more like what we saw in UCLA a few days ago. It's more like we saw 3 summers ago now in front of the Empire State Building with that workplace violence case. A single shot, a very limited number of targets, 1 target or so, is not someone looking for big numbers, is not the classic active shooter case. So there's a difference between targeted violence, which is much more of the shooting incident, than an active shooter situation, which is someone who's looking for that large casualty count. Now, as I said, kind of the first active shooter of record was the Texas Bell Tower shooter. Charles Whitman, recently out of the Marines, takes this high vantage point in the bell tower, and as a sniper, over the course of 90-95 minutes, one by one is picking off people who are moving about the campus. This event, interesting. There's lots we could talk about each of these shooting cases. But for our presentation today, we're going to hit just 4 milestone cases. A few things to notice about this case. First of all, it's a single shooter, right? It's him operating alone. He's using this handwritten journal. Now, we see this manifesto, we see this journal writing, we see videotapes come from our shooters over and over again in which they're ventilating about their grievances and their plans and such. But this is not new. This is not, just post-Columbine or post-Virginia Tech. We've seen this back to the original kind of active shooter case where there's, all this preparation going on. Now, interesting, he didn't pick up most of his weapons until the day of, didn't purchase most of his weapons until the day of the shooting. This event seems to actually have a really short planning curve. He picks a target-rich environment. It's a single shooter. He's stationary. He's not on the move. And he comes really kind of hunkered down with equipment and supplies for a siege. So he's thinking he's going to be this lone kind of sniper from a high vantage point for a while. Next big milestone, we go to Columbine. And I know for some of you, you'll think there's other cases that are more significant and such, but I just picked these 4 for these. They demonstrate the evolution well. 2 shooters, a much longer planning curve, again, are now writing not just simply handwritten documents. They are posting blogs and they're posting to websites about their views, about their sense of being wronged, about their sense or their need for justice. They are mobile through the shooting event, on the move. They're using a combination of explosives and weapons, and you have a very different thing. So here we see some same frustration venting, this documentation of the venting, and you also see that they have learned from other shooters. They've talked in their writings about things like the Oklahoma City bombing. They talked about other sorts of events, and they're looking at other violent individuals. They're trying to better those plans. And now is a milestone, even though it's outside of the states. Oslo and Utøya Island on July 22nd, 2011, some of you will recognize here Anders Breivik, who ends up surrendering to police. Now, Breivik is an ultra-nationalist. He thinks he's protecting the ethnic purity of Norway, and he attacks a summer camp for adolescents who will represent a rival political wing who are pro-immigrant. This is a very long planning curve. This guy actually tells us in court, he tells us in his writing that he's been planning for years, 7 years or more for this. He's got his mom sewing him military and law enforcement uniforms. She thinks he's into role-playing or costume playing. And ultimately, you may recall, he kills 69 kids at the camp. Before he goes to the camp on the island, he actually detonates a car bomb in the government district of Oslo, and he kills 8 people there as well. He's on the web. He's promoting his values. He writes this huge manifesto. He survives when he goes to court, where every court appearance he takes the platform and he just rails and rants about his extreme views. He picks a symbolic, target-rich environment. He's got this fascination with the military and all his uniforms. And this is another interesting milestone. And you'll see why more. I've selected these 4 milestones as we move through the program. And lastly, we go to San Bernardino. Here we have, again, 2 shooters, highly mobile, using what we're going to come to call hybrid targeted violence, which is simultaneously bombing, shooting, and other means. Here, a different motive. The motive seems to be terrorism. They seem to be radicalized individuals, and pick this target-rich environment. Now, interesting is this individual also is a co-worker, right, the husband of many of the people who were shot and killed at the Inland Center, folks who months before had thrown a baby shower for this couple when they had their first child. Now, this is very interesting because we see this evolution in communication, that every one of these people is writing and they're documenting, and the concept we're going to refer to psychologically, they're leaking information about their thoughts and their plans in different ways. But for us, where this case becomes interesting, is this is a case that is both terrorism and workplace violence simultaneously. So it's going to support our idea of type 5 violence in just a few moments. Target-rich environment, lots of web activity, mostly for self-radicalization, mobile, multiple targets, employing suicide, explosives, and we have this radicalized true believer mindset. So if you're not familiar with the concept, very quickly, and here you see the citation back to Frazano and Snyder, the concept of hybrid targeted violence, which is simultaneously the use of bombing, shooting, kidnapping in the same event, highly coordinated, using very sophisticated tactics. This is something that we saw in Belgium, we saw in Paris, we saw in a number of other recent events worldwide, and this is something we're increasingly concerned about, which is not just that lone actor. And you notice we've moved away from this phrase, the lone wolf, and now we've replaced that romanticized phrase with homegrown violent extremists. So we're seeing an evolution in tactics from the shooter, an evolution in communication of the shooter. So let's talk about type 5 violence very quickly. I'm counting on the fact that most of you will be familiar with the classic 4 types of workplace violence as per OSHA. Type 1, actually the most common and the most deadly, a criminal intent. This is robbery by a stranger who's targeted your location because there's something of value, cash, meds, electronics, and if a weapon's used in this robbery, yeah, bad things happen. In fact, 85% of workplace homicides happen in that category. Most common location, convenience store, taxis, limos, things of this nature, late at night, cash on hand. You follow me with the kind of setting we're in. Type 2, customer, client, patient. Healthcare workers 4 times more likely to be assaulted than any other kind of workers in the U.S. We know this person, and it's in the delivery of our normal services that someone we're working with becomes aggressive, becomes violent. What you and I typically think of when we hear the phrase workplace violence is coworker to coworker, coworker to supervisor. These are usually smoldering crises in which there's a sense of injustice that's been kind of stewing for a good long time, some sort of trigger point, and the individual decides that they're justified and that violence is the only appropriate response to the situation. 7% of workplace homicides happen in that category. And it is a problem for the workplace, and it is part of workplace violence, type 4, intimate partner or domestic violence that follows someone. Typically a woman is the target, typically a male is the perpetrator, follows her to work. And where this becomes most deadly is that maybe if, and where she tends to, let me rephrase, where the biggest risk is when she tries to separate from him. She's gone out of his life, doesn't know necessarily where she's gone. He doesn't know where to find her from 9 to 5, at your business. And if that person is looking for that kind of violence or aggression, you have a little bit of a sitting duck situation. But in the evolution of workplace violence, I want to talk about type 5 because all of those 4 types do represent a risk of active shooter scenarios. All can evolve to that level of violence. But more likely to quickly go to active shooter status is type 5 workplace violence, which is ideologically driven. So here the best recent example would be the Planned Parenthood shooting in Colorado Springs in November, in which very first court appearance, the shooter gets up and he says, "I'm a warrior for the babies." So he clearly articulates his ideological, his philosophical bent, and he sees this as justified. In the extremist mindset, the phrase often used is that a small harm may be necessary to justify a larger harm. So by targeting that facility and its people, that will save lives. We see this in biotech, we see this in pharmaceuticals, in which animal rights extremists, environmental extremists may also feel to prevent experimentation on animals, to prevent crop or genetically modified crops, that they are justified and that violence is necessary against the people and property of your organization. This is where workplace violence and terrorism intersect. They may select your organization because of what it symbolizes rage against who you are or what you do, but not necessarily the individuals who work there, but they do want to damage your organization. So we really recommend to you in maturing your program this idea of introducing to your workforce, when you do workplace violence training, the concept of type 5 violence. And as I said, the concepts of hybrid targeted violence as well. Here you see a graphic from the siege in Mumbai, another example, as was, going way back to Beslan and the Westgate Mall in Nairobi, all very, very clear sort of incidents of hybrid targeted violence. So we want to introduce you today to a few concepts. We want to introduce you to the concept of hybrid targeted violence, the concept of type 5 violence. These go very well hand in hand because these individuals who are trained up and usually working in teams are setting out to create the maximum carnage, and there we really fit the active shooter profile pretty well. Now I'm going to move through this section pretty quick because we have a lot left to do, and that's the police response. Very quickly, you remember pre-Columbine, Police response was surround the building, hold the perimeter, wait for special teams. 47 minutes went by before the first officers went in. We had people dying, obviously, in that environment, and the shooting continues. So after that, modification is into this concept of teams, where we wait for the first responding 4 or 5 officers to kind of squad up. We form different sorts of formations. We move into the facility and move towards the sound of shots, or the last place that the shooter was seen, as a way of neutralizing the shooter. All good. We come to something like Newtown, Connecticut, and we revisit tactics as well. And very common now is the idea of solo officer entry or 2-officer entry. Please notice in the FBI report 2014, 1 out of every 3 officers who goes in alone will be shot. So this is a very, very high-risk endeavor, going in as quickly as possible. But one of the statistics, I just kind of blew right by at the onset of this program, is another victim every 15 seconds in these cases that have been recorded. So the officer getting in there fast, it makes a real big difference. And like that today, and this is not just brand new, you may be familiar with the concept, is MACTAC. MACTAC, multiple assailants, right? So we have multiple assault counterterrorism action capabilities. This is the approach to something like the Paris attack, where we have multiple shooters at multiple locations using different sorts of devices. We saw this, of course, in Mumbai with the siege there as well. We saw 5 2-man teams in that situation. We saw in Paris the simultaneous attack of the theater, of the cafe area, outside the stadium. So this is the approach in law enforcement now to this dispersed sort of attack mode. Next evolution, very quickly, how we assess threat. We're moving beyond the idea of warning signs. What we use, first of all, we talk about a few key concepts. We don't use profiles at all anymore when we look at this sort of violence. When we use a profile, we end up with way too many false positives for it to be helpful, and ultimately it doesn't give it the answer we need. The answers we need are based exclusively in the communication and the behavior of the subject. And it's not simply who made a threat, because there are people who make a threat who have no intention of acting on it. And there are times when people are deadly and dangerous and they've never made a threat at all. And there's other instances in which people have done both. They've made a threat and they've acted on the threat. So the question at the end of the day is not who made a threat. The question is who poses a threat. And we know who poses a threat based on different commonalities, different empirical evidence that suggests when we hear and see these behaviors, we know that they correlate highly with the risk today of a mass shooting. So the different ideas I'm introducing to you right now, they're not the common workplace violence training signs. You could find that anywhere, like the guy's a loner, that kind of thing. These are widely publicized. What I want to introduce you to is some of the newer research, and here you see I'm citing Dr. Reed Malloy and his associates in San Diego, a few articles from the Journal of Behavioral Sciences and the Law that identify 8 warning behaviors. Now, warning behaviors are different than warning signs. They're clusters of different behavior and communications. They're not these one-off sort of things. But what are the indicators of? They're indicators of someone who's on the pathway to potentially mass violence, to an active shooter event. So there's obviously overlap between someone who would be demonstrating the precursor behavior of workplace violence and this. But my point is, as you prepare and as you train people, please start teaching them about the pre-incident indicators of a mass shooter, as well as the classic pre-incident indicators of just simply a workplace violence situation. Very quickly, I'm going to go back one slide. I mentioned there were 8 key warning behaviors. We have time today only to touch base on 1 or 2. We're going to focus on leakage. And leakage is the idea that most people do tell, they do let out different ways, communications, about what they're thinking about, what they're planning. 2 big studies, 67% of adults, 58% of adolescents. In the smaller study by Dr. Mary Ellen O'Toole at the FBI, 100% in her smaller cases of incidents where people had clearly told us what they plan to do. Now today they tell us in different ways, and very commonly they're telling us in social media. So as we're looking and as we're researching a person of concern, very important to try to get a read on their social media activity. Sorry about that, let me go back. Where people very often post photographs of themselves, their weapons, their thoughts, their plans, and such. Regardless of how they tell us, what sort of setting they tell us, the themes are very common. and they're kind of end of the road. They're hopelessness. They know that there's no tomorrow. Guys, every active shooter knows when they fire off that first shot, this is on the way to being over for them. Many, almost half, end with suicide. Significant number end before the police even arrive from bystander intervention. Very few of these people have demonstrated that they've come in with any sort of exit strategy. So themes of hopelessness, of despair, of isolation, sometimes of vengeance are all part of that, and sometimes that different idea of seeking notoriety. So here's our fourth evolution, and I want to spend some time on this because this is some new thinking as well. So we've talked a little bit about how the nature of shooters and shooting events has changed. And I would really recommend those two documents, the FBI study and the NYPD study. They really go into specific cases and specific settings, and you want to be building your plans around accurate behavioral assumptions. So you need to know about those shooting events. You can't generalize. You really want to dig in. We talked about the evolution a little bit in terms of police response, and then here I'm going to mention EMS response a little more thoroughly. And then we talked a little bit about newer thinking in threat detection, and that's really bringing in, whether it's to your threat assessment team or just in your worker-to-worker training about recognizing workplace violence, make sure we start talking about the pre-incident indicators of mass shooting, and those were those 8 warning behaviors that I mentioned. But let's finish off the program by introducing some key concepts of bystander intervention. And again, this is interesting because it's one of the very, very few crimes that you can think of in which law enforcement are making assumptions that bystanders will be involved, that this, all of us are potentially first responders. So how do we know what to do then as a first responder? Well, so far the national training has been run, hide, fight. And that's excellent, but run, hide, fight is intended simply to stop the killing. We want to go beyond that. I'm going to tell you why in just a moment. But very often I talk to leaders and organizations and they say, Steve, our upper management, they're a little bit jittery about this. They don't want us to show that video. It's too frightening, or they don't want us to talk about these things. It's going to have a chilling effect on the workforce. I want to talk just really quickly about some of the research. This from Dr. Kim Witt at the University of Michigan. Look at how people mentally process threat information. We tell them about a threat. And this was done across different industries and different sorts of threats. It's actually done across different countries as well. When we're given information about a threat, like active shooter, and I'm not talking about a case in the moment, like there's a shooter in the lobby. I'm talking about when we're doing training and we're developing policy. What people do quickly is they run it through 2 filters. The very first is about the threat itself, and they ask 2 questions. Severity, how big and bad is the situation? And then the susceptibility, does this have anything to do with me? And if we meet those 2 challenges, the next questions are about efficacy, about confidence in themselves and the organizations. Well, this is what it looks like in terms of mapping out the mental process. And if we get to that first level of appraisal and the person feels that this doesn't have anything to do with me or it's not serious, they reject the message and they're not going to get motivated or involved. Quickly, I'm talking nanoseconds, they move to the second level of appraisal. Does this have to do with me? And rather, is this something that I'm prepared for? This is confidence. Is this something my organization's prepared for? If the answers to those are no, people are very afraid, you made them afraid, but they're not going to be useful participants in your plan. But the third level, most important, is if we meet those 2 challenges, the message is accepted and we get a behavioral change. And the behavioral change is to be that active and effective participant in bystander intervention. So we don't want to sugarcoat risk. We don't want to downplay it because then we don't get people into the right quadrant where we want to have high confidence in themselves but a reasonable level of concern that this is something they should pay attention to. And in the research, people make statements like, I know my response can make a difference. I know I can do what's expected of me. I have an important role in the response. And guess what? When people have those thoughts and feelings, they become effective bystanders. Now, this research from Blair at the University of Texas, very quickly, we looked at 84 cases, and you see that in 40 of them, they end before the police arrive. That's the midline on this graphic. But in 16 of the 40, it ends by bystander intervention, by victims stopping the attacker. What this says in very plain language is people can and people do intervene against an armed attacker even if they're unarmed. So we have to teach our workers, what does it mean to fight? And fight at the most basic level It means distract, disrupt, and if possible, disarm, and use everything at your disposal in terms of improvised weapons, work as a team if there's other people with you, and teach people very basic things like DATS, D-A-T-T-S. If you're at hands and arm's length of a weapon, we push the weapon down into the side. So we eliminate the possibility of someone being fired at accidentally as we're trying to wrestle this person. But employees can and do. They want to know these things. But the next level of bystander intervention, and this is critical, folks, is the evolution of stop the dying. What we know, and this is now part of our national mindset. If you're not familiar, I'd recommend you to the Hartford Consensus. The Hartford Consensus from the American College of Surgeons took the lessons learned in Iraq, Afghanistan about combat casualties, and we started here in the States to develop a rescue task force. Rescue task force means that we're training up some EMS personnel in your community. We're gearing them up with ballistic vests and helmets so they can go in under the cover of police and operate in the warm zone so we can get to casualties quicker. Because what we know is most people who die in an active shooter event, they die by bleeding out, and they're going to be dead in 2 to 3 minutes. Now, we know the average response time for police and EMS is usually from 5 minutes to about 15 minutes, depending on your jurisdiction. I said to you that 60-some-odd% of these were over in 5 minutes or less. How can we then step back if we've got people hurt and not intervene? How can we not be bystanders and first responders here? So the old school, as I said, was we would wait until law enforcement cleared the environment. We would take casualties from the warm zone out to the cold zone to the casualty collection point, and then EMS would drop in and start their thing. Now the logic, as I said, is we get EMS into the warm zone under this rescue task force model, and we start care immediately. You need to factor that into your plan. You need to find out if your community is doing that, and then factor that into your drills, exercise, and plans. But where this is going, knowing how important, not the golden hour, but the platinum minutes are that really can prevent a death, we're doing something very different, and that's starting to train civilians. So here, an article by Justin Bumgardner at AMU, he's talking about different programs around the country where they're teaching civilians how to use gauze, how to use tourniquets, how to be the first responder to stop the dying. And this case that we're making for Beacon, basic bleeding control, I want to help you understand that this is part of a national campaign. Let me see if I could find that for a second. I think I put that in here. Hold on one second, guys. Sorry to scroll through the slides like this. If you have not seen it, and I'm sorry I didn't include the slide, please go on to dhs.gov, Department of Homeland Security, and simply type in Stop the Bleed. There is a new national campaign from the Department of Homeland Security that is intended to teach civilians basic bleeding control. Now, to help facilitate basic Beacon bleeding control, many organizations are starting to prepare for that with some basic training, but also basic supplies. So down the hall by the AED on your wall, we may have trauma kits. And in the trauma kit, what you have are different throw kits that have all the basics in a vacuum-packed little case. Someone with no experience in first aid, in EMS, or in bleeding control can zip one of these cases open, take out the big poster board that's all all color illustrations, and learn on the spot and in a high-stress environment how to apply a tourniquet, how to pack a wound. Now, some of the vendors that we're working with have gone on into the sort of model that the AED units are using, and you open the case and it talks you through. It's electronic and it talks you through how to apply a tourniquet, how to apply gauze. But regardless, the key idea here is in those first moments, all of us are those bystanders and all of us are first responders. We need some basic orientation around what we would do, how we would do it, and what equipment we need to successfully stop the dying. So bystander intervention, it starts even before the shooting. It starts with recognizing that someone in the workplace is distressed and may be moving towards that path of violence. It starts with understanding the 8 warning signs of terrorism and seeing that person outside who's acting strangely and talking to security about that. That's pre-event. During the event, that's run, hide, fight. That's stopping the killing. That's tremendously important. But then as immediately as we're in a safe position, the shots have stopped, the shooter's down, We want the same bystanders to move now into a first responder mode and know how to use the basic equipment that's in these kits. And lastly, for anyone who has seen the active shooter video, Run, Hide, Fight from the Houston Mayor's Office, if you haven't, I'd simply direct you to YouTube to find Run, Hide, Fight. Many people watch this one scene of the woman in the red sweater who's freaking out in the break room while all her coworkers are trying to put together a quick plan about how they're going to fight the shooter if he comes into the room. She is obviously part of the problem. They're trying to be super quiet. They're trying to let the shooter, maybe luckily walk right by them. And she is just hysterical. What do we do with her? So we introduced the idea of zero-hour behavioral management. Zero-hour behavioral management starts with psychological first aid. Psychological first aid is intended for the 0 to 48 hours of a crisis event, of a traumatic, threatening, violent event. It is 0 hours, 0 to 48, so it's right then and there in the crisis. And if you look at the last few sentences on this slide, from the National Academy of Science, the Institute of Medicine, psychological first aid is a skill set designed to limit the stress and negative behaviors that increase fear and arousal. It is not counseling. It is not mental health. It's down and dirty. How do I speak to someone to help them reel it in, focus that person, and get them through the crisis and the immediate post-crisis environment? Now, I just want to make a quick observation. Let me go back here 1 second. I apologize. A few of my slides seem to be out of order on this slide set. There's a difference between psychological first aid and mental health first aid. Very quickly, mental health first aid, great training. You learn about the major mental illnesses, what's the difference between thought disorder, mood disorder, anxiety disorder. You learn the signs and symptoms. You learn how to intervene with someone having a psychiatric crisis. You learn how to connect them to the right resources. But the assumption is the person has or is developing a diagnosable mental health condition. That's not psychological first aid. Psychological first aid is for everyone in the environment, mental health issues or not, who is just having that traumatic stress reaction or an emergency stress reaction in the face of a real threatening event. Last part of our evolution is our focus on communication, and the most important aspect I could share with you is this first bullet point. There's no better way to defeat the shooter than to take away their targets. And the very, very, very best way to take away their targets in this very time-sensitive environment is through having your communications all put together, having your templates ready to go, having tested these, knowing that I can get out key messages in that response gap, that short window between shots fired and the first incoming police. We have to be able to tell people what's going on. We have to be able to tell people what's expected of them, where to go, what to do. And we have to let people know how they'll receive second communications to let them know if it's all clear or other actions are needed. Now, a few things to think about in your message. It's probably going to need to be multi-layered because there may be people in one part of your facility who you expect one movement from. It's evacuate. And people in another part of your facility or different area may have to lock down. So you want to really think through that there's really not going to be one universal message. And as you develop those templates, really to develop several for within the response gap, within the shooting event itself. But then I also want you to think about after that, because even though the shooter may be down, there's going to be a lot that you need to communicate in the immediate wake of the crisis as well, and you need to keep using your tools. Please notice as you develop your prepared messages, you do want to float them past your risk managers, your legal advisors and such in terms of how you're thinking, what you're thinking, but have your messages all stacked up and ready to go. And we really advocate, and this is a kind of a national sort of thrust right now, to have your messages in plain language, right? So we're moving away from codes because if you think about it, codes really came out of the hospital environment where we wanted to say in this discreet way that there's a problem in this unit. Someone's having a heart attack. That's a code red. Or someone's, in the mental health unit is acting out. This is a Dr. Strong. You are trying to be discreet. Here, you don't want to be discreet. The shooter knows there's a shooter in the building. They got it. And you want everyone else to know there's a shooter in the building as well. So you want the visitor and the guest and everyone who might not have been privy to the code, you want everyone to know immediately about the nature of the threat. Key points, when you form your messages, You tell people what's happening in plain language. You tell them what to do in plain language. You let them know how other information will be shared, whether it's all clear or other actions are needed. And you have to make sure there's continuity and consistency across all your platforms. So text and voice and any other ways that you're doing it, because any variation is going to cause confusion, and that obviously can get dangerous for us. As I said, even when the shooter's down, you need to think about ongoing communications, starting with an all-clear message. You're going to have to focus on immediate employee notification or reunification. You know in a shooting event you're going to have employees' families rushing down to your facilities. You need to be thinking about how we work in terms of messaging for family unification. You might not want people to leave the environment, who may be witnesses. And you need to bake this into your overarching business continuity plans as well. Think about your communications, honestly, for at least a week plus post-incident, right? You have to really keep information flowing to people, and a lot of folks, they're not going to come back to work the next day. Some are going to be terrified, and depending on the severity of your event, you know, you may be closed for a short period of time, or parts of your business may be closed. So you want to leverage your communication tools and your mass notification tools to the limit by really thinking from the shots fired situation on hour one, day one, and week one. This is a slide I was making reference to earlier. I'm sorry it's out of place. It was just making a quick distinction between mental health first aid and psychological first aid. And I did explain this, but know that when you get the slide set, now I will send the corrected slide set for any of you who are interested. Let's wrap up, though, because I know we have some important messages from our team really about the product. Bottom line, guys, I think you can all take this away. These are very, very complex, obviously very dangerous sorts of events. The ones we're referring to now as hybrid targeted violence, where we see the evolution of the thinking of the shooter, it calls for many new actions by us. It can't be the standard out-of-the-box run, hide, fight. That is your starting place. Run, hide, fight, it's your starting place. And this idea in maturing is how do I leverage bystander intervention before, through good threat detection, during, where we're really moving, you know, as I said, from knowing how to fight to then after the fact, and I mean minutes and seconds after the fact, to stopping the dying and stopping the crying. So think about psychological first aid as maybe a necessary skill set, maybe training as many people in your organization in that as you have trained in CPR. Think about starting to train up and gear up for bleeding control, and make sure people understand they are the first responders in these incidents. Guys, thank you so much for your attention. I hope that was interesting and takes you a little further down the pipeline in your thinking about preparing for this kind of risk. Well?
All right, thank you, Steve. Now I'm going to turn it over to Michael Zhang, who will provide an overview of Everbridge for you all.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, to join the webinar. I think Stephen has given a very great understanding about the active shooters and the preparedness and the accuracy of the messaging and how to respond to the situation. Everbridge, we are doing the unified critical communication for all the customers. Our company founded in 2002, and currently we have 5 offices around the world, and we serve global pretty much around 2,000 customers around the world. So as you see on this slide, we are ranked as #1 by Gartner for this emergency communication system, and we actually send over 1 billion messages a year, and for 100 million contacts managed. Because from what Stephen said, that in this situation, you want a reliable system. You want to be able to reach out to your police, to your emergency response team, all the teams fastly, quickly, and reliably. Next slide. This is basically a snapshot of customers that have been using Everbridge from different industries. Many of you who joined the webinar, you might from business continuity function, you might also from the police department or public safety. So from this, we can show you that we have done all of that, and all our expertise can really help you in this active shooting preparedness. So So as Stephen said, that when you have this active shooting, you need to make sure the people can respond quickly, and also the message can get out to the people outside the emergency, and also you can notify the commanders, executives quickly. So in this kind of communication, Everbridge offer you different channels, also offer you different models. You can notify people by email, SMS, voice, and also you can provide text-to-speech as well. So from overview, based on what Stephen has said, Everbridge provide your clients or your citizens or your employees with, in any situations, you can provide, we provide you with different channels, and also you can use our polling messages or escalation or even one-click conference bridge to get everybody on the call to communicate the situation, to make sure everybody understands what is going on, so that the communication can help you reduce the effect and eventually help the event less impact to the society. Next one. This is one sample, the templates Everbridge offers. So this is our template that you can design for any situation such as active shooting, even other instances, that you can put your planned response and also the planned action flow into this template, so that when anything happened, whoever is on duty should be able to just click and put a simple text, and then should be able to send it out. So we work with, for example, we work with Boston Police here in Boston, and before they use an Everbridge, their average response time probably around 35 to 40 minutes to get everything together and the information and send out to everybody and find out who I should send to. When they start to use the Everbridge, like this template-based, workflow-based notification, they actually reduce their communication time to around 1 minute. So it's a very impressive results even for us. So this is one of our Everbridge's most popular capability across hospitals, public safety, and even the corporates. So in this example, we are showing that you can also do the communication based on maps. So if any shooting goes on, and you should be able to draw a circle around the shooting address, then leverage Everbridge, send out the information to the people around that area. And you see there are also other buildings, meaning you can also activate a different template and send a message to other people in other buildings and warning them to not come to this area. So that will give you the three purpose you want to achieve, right? To make sure you can get a response fast, you can protect people to not come to this area. You can also activate different templates which will send to the commanders or executives. In Everbridge, you can also send multiple templates at the same time, so that will enable you to achieve the results in a very reduced time to the impact. Next.
All right, thank you, Michael. At this point, we are going to move on to our question and answer portion of the session. We have some questions that were submitted prior to the live event, but we're also going to take questions on the fly. As a reminder, you can submit your question at any time by typing it into the open text field in the questions panel on your screen and submitting it to all panelists. First question we have is for you, Michael. Does Everbridge allow us to send a notification that gives employees the ability to respond back saying they're safe during an active shooter event?
Yes. So there are different ways you can do that. One is they can send a polling message to everybody, say in one building. And in the polling, you can say the first one is, are you safe? The second one is, I'm not safe, or then different options. When whoever receives the message, they can actually click, send a text back to you, say, I'm safe, I'm not safe, so you will know instantly how many people reply safe, how many people reply they are not safe. Then you can take a further action with it. for example, send a follow-up to the people who reply unsafe, give them instructions to take further actions.
All right, thank you. Our next question we have is for you, Steve. What are some of the first steps a company should take after the shooter has been neutralized? Steve, you're out there? Steve?
No, I'm back. I'm sorry. I was on mute there for a moment. One of the very first, of course, is accountability of knowing where all of our people are. So this is a very important part of actually Everbridge's architecture as well, which is to be able to connect with people and get that feedback to know that people are, are okay. There's important structural things to be doing, of course, which are liaisons with that incident command staff from the first responders so that we're coordinating and letting the first responders know about what our plans are and what we have at our disposal to help work in a coordinated manner with them. Obviously, that works better pre-event in terms of planning and exercising with the locals. But one of the very first steps you have to make sure you have covered is accountability and knowing where people are, because there's such anxiety, and actually it's the greatest source of anxiety in an event like this, of separation from folks and not knowing where they are. And it's very likely that people are having a hard time, communicating, or they still may be locked in, sheltering and hiding. So accountability is one of the very first action steps.
All right, thank you, Steve. Next question is for you, Michael. With the time-sensitive nature of an active shooter event, are we able to send a message to multiple contact paths at the same time through Everbridge?
Yes. So in Everbridge, there are different settings. You can set in by sending to multiple paths one by one, or you can also say sending the same all the paths at the same time. And remember, we also have a mobile app in Everbridge. So in some cases, mobile phone is the most popular. So you can send to the message to the mobile app as well from Everbridge.
All right, Steve. Next question is for you. We've had a few questions around liability. One of them being the throw and carry kits are a fantastic idea. Where does liability come into factor? I can see someone doing the right thing and then getting chastised or held liable for trying to help the victim.
Yeah, it's not the very best answer, which is it typically falls under this kind of Good Samaritan doctrine. This is part of the reason you do need to work in concert with your legal, your HR, your risk management people to discuss that. So think about it. Do you have people trained in your organization who would use, who know how to do CPR? And do you have people who you'd expect to use the AED? And if you've provided training to folks in AED or CPR, the same sort of mindset is that's probably not a medical person, or most likely not an EMT or someone who's certified necessarily by a sanctioning body. How is it that we cover liability around someone doing CPR if they've just had minimal training, or how would we sanction someone using an AED we've hung on the wall if they're not a medical person? So the logic kind of is, if we're providing gear for people, the same way we provide an AED, how is it that our legal partners see that from a good Samaritan or a bystander perspective? It's typically being equated with an AED or other basic first aid gear that you may have on site.
All right, thank you, Steve. Next question is for you, Michael. The template notifications, what product for Everbridge are those included in?
So Everbridge have three different products you can actually use for this kind of a scenario. But it basically can be one package. We call it message notification. So in message notification, you can send a ad hoc message. Basically, everything have to be written, have to be like context from the very beginning. We call it notification. You also can use another called the incident communication module, which is that like the screenshots I showed you earlier, you will be able to pre-configure the template. Say when active shooting happens, then these people should be notified. This is a message to use. Then these are the parts that need to be changed. So So in this case, even anybody who has no knowledge or is not very good at writing, they can still go in there, make minimum changes, and send it out. So that's called incident communication. That's very popular, especially in the in procedure-based environment. You can just put the procedure into this template. Another one is the map. So you can use we call it universe. That's actually part of the package. The universe that you can select people based on the map. Also, if anybody has a mobile app on Everbridge, they can actually send any kind of a short message back to the map, so that whoever is managing the situation will know that what's going on in there. People actually can take pictures and send it back as well. So whoever the command center will be able to collect information from all the people and make instant judgments.
All right, thank you, Michael. We are over our allotted amount of time, but we're going to get to just a few more questions since so many have been coming in. If we don't get to your question, we will try our best to have somebody follow up with you after the event. Steve, next question is for you. Do you have any advice for senior managers who are hesitant about running an active shooter training?
The very best advice I could give them is they should all be acquainted with the American National Standard. The American National Standard in Workplace Violence Prevention and Intervention was published in September of 2011 by ANSI, American National Standards Institute, in combination with ASIS, American Society for Industrial Security, and SHRM, Society for Human Resource Management. The reason I bring this up is this document has very quickly become the plaintiff's attorney's touchstone in the courtroom. In any sort of litigation that is brought in the wake of a workplace violence case or an active shooter case, this question comes up. The question is, does your organization know that there is a national standard? And it's not regulatory, but it's an industry standard. And show us, how do you align and how do you comply with the different aspects of these standards? Your senior leadership should also be aware of OSHA's position, and they should also know that beginning in September of 2011 as well, OSHA radically stepped up in its investigation, its citations, and its fines around this. So when you start drilling down on the business case for this, and the business case, really is that like many risks we face, the cost of not doing this and going in and trying to explain how we were not prepared for what is somewhat of a foreseeable risk at this point, it puts the company in a very, very untenable position in terms of litigation, in terms of cost. But I would start there. Make sure that your senior managers are aware that there's a national standard, and they should be very clear on OSHA's position, because the cost of not doing this is far greater and daunting when compared to the cost and the stress of introducing these programs into our workplace.
All right, thank you, Steve. Next question we have is for you, Michael. Is the Everbridge system able to send notifications across different cell phone carriers?
Yes. Yeah, we can send notification across all the carriers, and even we can send to some of the pager system you have in hospitals as well.
All right, let's do one last question here. Steve, somebody wants to know your thoughts on the ALICE model in preparing for an active shooter event.
Most of the key components of ALICE are similar to the logic of Unhide Fight. It's a little more detailed and has a little more direction to it. For me, I do not have a preferred model. I like the ALICE model. I think that there's a few out there that are very good. The framework becomes something that's helpful for people to remember their action steps. It trains them, I think, essentially the right behaviors. But regardless, to me, what is more important is working with the workforce in terms of how you're creating the message, not necessarily a post-incident message or a response message, but how you're creating the culture and the climate where we're expecting people, and we know that people can be viable responders. ALICE, always kind of took that into account, this idea that people could be good first responders. So regardless if it's the ALICE model or if you're using any other model, more important is your organization's culture and a mindset of readiness that you're actually promoting this idea within people what they do and how they do it actually can save their lives and save the lives of many people around them. So certainly, I wouldn't criticize the Alice approach in any way, but I'd suggest that the core elements of Alice and the core elements of most of the major models right now are putting you in the right direction. I don't think there's a model out there which I would say, oh no, don't do that. Do something, adopt a model, and train people thoroughly in it, and make sure the message is, you know, we believe totally that people can and will do the right thing when it comes to the time. You know, guys, last thought about that, if you're not familiar, is the idea that during a crisis, we do not rise to the occasion. We fall to our training. So whatever training model you pick, commit to it, get the word out, and really reinforce it in drills, exercises, and in good messaging to your workforce.
All right, thank you, Steve. With that, we are going to wrap up. I do want to remind everybody that we will be sending out a copy of the slides and a recording of today's webinar in the next couple of days. I want to thank Steve and Michael for a great session, and to all of our attendees who were able to join us today. If you missed any part of the webinar, we will be also posting the slides on the blog. You'll also, as I said, you'll also receive an email with a link to the recording in the coming days. And if you haven't already, please take a moment to follow us at Everbridge and join our group on LinkedIn, Everbridge Incident Management and Emergency Notification Professionals. For those of you interested in requesting a demo of the Everbridge system, please visit everbridge.com/request-demo. Once again, I want to thank you all again for your participation in today's webinar. We hope to see you online again soon. Have a great day.